Hey everyone, it's Crystal again. And today we're going to be reviewing Disney Plus's Loki, episode 1. I'm a little behind the 8 ball because as I record this, I'm pretty sure episode 2 is already out. But we're going to film this quickly. And after like 8,000 hours of editing this one, hopefully I can get the second one done before the third one comes out. So let's get into it. It is a sunny and beautiful Wednesday. The trees are chirping, the birds are blooming. Let's get into it. So just to catch you up really quickly, Loki was killed in Infinity War by Thanos. He had his neck snapped. If you remember, Loki was on a ship with Asgard refugees escaping their dying planet. He had the Tesseract with him and he betrayed Thanos. Thanos' ship descends upon them. Thanos grabs the Space Stone housed within the Tesseract, snaps Loki's neck, and that was that. Then we see Loki again in Endgame, where the Avengers are traveling to different points in time to retrieve the Infinity Stones to undo the damage that Thanos did to the world. Particularly to retrieve the Space Stone, the Avengers travel back in time to the events of 2012, where Loki is apprehended, they get the Tesseract, but through a series of mishaps, Loki happens to escape, he grabs the Tesseract, and he branches off into another timeline. The events of the Disney Plus TV series pick up from that juncture, from 2012 Loki escaping the clutches of the Avengers and with the Tesseract and the Space Stone within it. Yeah, I think that's it. You're all caught up. That's awesome. In fact, the first episode of Loki kicks off with a quick little recap of the events of 2012, just before Loki escapes and creates this alternative timeline. Now let's do a super quick rundown of this episode before I actually get into the review. Once he escapes with the Tesseract, he gets transported to this desert-like area, and he is apprehended by patrol officers belonging to a bureaucratic organization known as the Time Variance Authority, or the TVA. The TVA is essentially responsible for governing all of the timelines in the multiverse and is ensuring that there are no unsanctioned disruptions. So the moment Loki used the Tesseract to branch off into his own timeline, that sort of alerted them to his activities, and he's now apprehended by them. Loki is then taken to the Time Variance Authority's headquarters, which is what looks like a 50s style futuristic bunker, a lot of brown sepia tones, whereupon he's questioned about his time traveling motives by officers known as the Minutemen. He then meets Owen Wilson's character, Mobius, who's an agent who works with the TVA to investigate particularly dangerous criminals or variants, basically people who disrupt the space and time continuum. This episode then sees Loki interacting with different characters within the TVA and learning their basic bureaucratic layout of who does what. At one point he escapes their clutches, he threatens a well-meaning clerk, he plays with something called a time twister that seems to warp time and teleports you from room to room. He even finds a bunch of infinity stones in a drawer, stones that were collected from different timelines, although in the TVA, they are rendered useless because magic doesn't really work in the TVA, so the joke was that they're essentially being used as paperweights by the officers in the organization. At one point, while being questioned by Mobius, Loki also sees a holographic presentation of his entire life as it plays out across all of these different timelines, and he realizes that, again, remember, this is 2012 Loki, so once he sees his life play out in the regular timeline, sees that he unintentionally was the reason for his mother's death, and he also gets his neck snapped by Thanos eventually if he continues down the original timeline. So that sort of knocks the wind out of him a little bit, and then he decides to cooperate with Mobius and the TVA to track down another dangerous time variant. And that time variant just so happens to be Loki from another timeline. We're entering into head-churning territory, but stay with me. I'm trying to be as accurate as possible, but stay with me. Now let's get to the fun part, the actual review. I would rate this episode a 6 out of 10. Alright, hear me out. I would rate it a 6 because, unsurprisingly, Tom Hiddleston's performance is top-notch. it doesn't really get any better than that. He is a powerhouse of an actor. His emotions, his delivery is just all-encompassing. I would also rate it a 6 on the expectation that future episodes pick up just a little bit, because I feel like the pacing of this episode was a bit slow. Initially, it kicked off with a lot of momentum when he was taken in by the TVA and he was brought to this interesting bunker. But then I feel like the scene where he was being questioned by Owen Wilson's Mobius dragged on a little too long, to the point where there was not a lot of dynamic, there were not a lot of action scenes, there was not a lot of dynamic pacing. It just was like a prolonged conversation that I couldn't wait to see the end of. Now, I do want to preface all of this by saying that personally, time travel as a plot device isn't really my cup of tea. Don't get me wrong, when it's done well, it's done really, really well. See Interstellar, for example. But mostly what I've noticed is time travel is used in a really lazy way, where it destroys the integrity of the previous installments in that particular franchise, and it also removes the emotional punch of certain scenes, like when you use time travel to bring a dead character back to life, or to undo a particularly poignant character development plot point, right? If you use it for those types of things, I feel like it just compromises the entire plot, to the point where your audience is not going to care when you add in particularly emotional scenes in the future. All right, so getting back on point, let's talk about the things that I did like, particularly 3 things. Well, first things first, of course, Tom Hiddleston. He is a juggernaut, a powerhouse, a firebrand of an actor, and you won't be disappointed. Even if you watch this solely for Tom Hiddleston, you'll be frothing in the mouth, and you'll definitely get your fix. I can guarantee you that. I'm particularly afraid that they might try to rehab his bad boy image just to be more in line with the main character, the protagonist of a TV show. I hope they don't do that too much. I understand they'd have to do it to a certain extent because he can be all bad, but I'm hoping that they balance that out in a way that still stays true to the original character. The second thing I really liked was I liked the sets and the set pieces. It was a very nostalgic, as I said, 50s style, futuristic bunker with a lot of brown sepia tones. I thought that was really evocative in its own way. Really liked it. Speaking of the nostalgia factor, there was also a particular scene with an intergalactic colonial empire that looked like a cross between Asgard and Wakanda. And that was seen through like a window of the TVA bunker. So that was a really interesting setting. There's also a really sneaky DB Cooper reference in there, where we're led to believe that Loki was actually the infamous DB Cooper who hijacked a plane and then hopped off it with a suitcase full of money, and only to have completely disappeared on the face of the planet, and no one really knows what happened to him. So in this case, it's sort of explained to be that he just exited our timeline. DB Cooper, aka Loki, exited our timeline and went into another. Really good cultural reference, sort of anchors everything in there for me. So far, so good. Now, getting into the things that I wasn't really falling off my seat about. Actually, let's get into something that I was on the fence about. Not too crazy about, but this is by no means a deal breaker. This doesn't really come across as your typical Marvel property. It has a different feel to it. So for me, it came across as like your run-of-the-mill science fiction thriller. Think like Tenet or Ender's Game or Valerian. What was the Cara Delevingne one? Valerian and the City of 1,000 Planets. It doesn't really read like a Marvel property quite just yet. Oh, and if anyone else can relate to this episode also reminded me of that episode of Gravity Falls, if anyone remembers. The one where Dipper is trying to score a date with Wendy, and so he uses time travel as a way to explore different scenarios where she doesn't end up with Robbie. And I think his time travel then attracts the attention of the time police. Blendin, I think it was this guy called Blendin Blandin, who was sent to rectify Dipper's mistakes. This very much came across as that. It gave me serious Gravity Falls vibes. I want to touch upon the character Loki himself. He definitely comes across a little differently in this one. Now, I don't know if you deem that a good thing or a bad thing. It's really up to each person to decide. But in this one, he isn't necessarily your typical, the conniving, mischievous little shit of a brother that we see in previous installments. Rather, he's more vulnerable in this one. He's more layered, I suppose. I think there's even a scene in there where he admits that this is just a veneer of mischief and evil that he feels like was the mantle of which was placed upon his shoulders, and he needs to live up to that. We see a different side of him in this episode, which, it's not necessarily a good thing or a bad thing, it's just a thing. I touched upon this a little bit before, but I think the momentum really broke at around the 20-ish minute mark. Overall, this episode ran to about 50 minutes if we're counting the credit scenes, but at around the 20-ish minute mark, it got a little slow because there was this prolonged scene of Loki and Mobius in the interrogation room where Mobius was trying to put the screws to Loki and figure out what his plans would be if he were to be released by the TVA. I would have preferred more dynamism, more action scenes perhaps, cooler costumes. Loki was sort of wearing this cocky jailbird jumpsuit throughout the entire episode. So again, there was not a lot to go off of just yet to build that momentum. By the way, a fun little side note, I noticed Loki, aka Tom, looked directly into the camera twice during the interrogation scene. Did anyone else catch that? Let me know in the comments below. Now, this one is going to be a little controversial to say, and a lot of people might disagree with me, but it's clear to see that the show is setting up this potential bromance between Owen Wilson's Mobius and, of course, Tom's Loki. I'm just on the fence. I'm not sure if they have the best chemistry just yet. I'm yet to be convinced. Again, Loki is this powerhouse. Owen's performances tend to be a little more under the breath, a little more subdued, to the point where he does really well in his lane, where he does rom-coms or like the typical junkie surfer. In this one, again, vis-a-vis Tom, I'm not sure whether they balance each other out the best, but you know what? I'm waiting to be proven wrong because individually I like them both, but just in separate types of movies. This was something that was not really made very clear. So in this universe, in the TVA, there are 3 timekeepers who essentially control all of the timelines in the multiverse and decide which are sanctioned and which are not. Loki lovingly dubs them space lizards, I think. The Avengers traveling back in time in the events of Endgame to collect the Infinity Stones and save the planet, restore humanity. That was sanctioned by the 3 space lizards. Loki's time travel with the Tesseract was not, and hence he was apprehended and brought in. I'm just curious to know, by what yardstick do they measure time travel? Like, what is sanctioned and what is not? What is seen as a disruption in the space and time continuum, and what isn't? So far, that precedent has not really been established. It was sort of poo-pooed away when Loki asked the question. So we'll see. We'll see in future episodes whether that's delineated a little more. But as of right now, it's still a mystery. Someone else pointed out, can't remember whether this was on Reddit or not, but someone pointed out Steve Rogers traveling back in time to be with Peggy in Endgame, and then he returns an old man. Was that sanctioned? Again, what is the yardstick? What is good time travel and what is bad time travel? By no means a deal breaker, because for all we know, it's going to be really fleshed out in a future episode, but just something to think about for now. Yep, that's pretty much it, I think. All in all, again, 6 out of 10. Something that I don't really like that a lot of these shows and movies tend to do is they take really stuff that was deemed really powerful and all-encompassing in a previous installment or property, and then in this one, they really downplay it to upplay something else. For example, in this one, the Infinity Stones are no more useful than paperweights. Their magic is rendered completely useless within the confines of the TVA. And so now we have to just sit there and grapple with the fact that, okay, well, literally everything that happened in Infinity War and Endgame was they're just paperweights to a higher power. I don't really like the downplaying of powerful items, as a conceit, in a way to make something else look more interesting and powerful. My final gripe with it is that time travel, again, has been used way too much across too many forms of entertainment to destroy the integrity of previously established plot points. So for example, with this one, really we're getting reacquainted with 2012 Loki. So all of the character development and the bonding even that he had with Thor in the subsequent Avengers movies and in the subsequent Thor movies after the first Avengers in 2012, all of that has sort of been undone. And now we're getting to know him in a different timeline, which again sort of destroys that sequential order of things, sort of destroys this entire journey that we as an audience have been with him on. So I'm not sure how to feel about that. A solid 6 out of 10, because my appetite has been whet, where I'm very, very curious and invested. I'm definitely going to be watching this entire series all the way through, if for nothing else, for Tom. And if you're watching it with me, let me know in the comments below your overall thoughts and concerns and gripes and praise even. And if there's something that I said that was incongruous or that you thought was complete BS, let me know in the comments below. Honestly, call me out. And with that, I'm going to watch episode 2 and I will talk to you incredibly, alarmingly, uncomfortably soon. Bye!